Hey there, everyone. Josh Heath. I am the Chief Operations Officer of High Level Games. I am enjoying the U.S. government shutdown to talk about game design, right? I'm here to talk about game design, and I think I just sent out a link that broke. So if anyone actually makes it to this today, we'll be very impressed. But regardless, I'm going to continue and hopefully share this in the future out there to the world because I think the topic is important. What am I talking about today? I'm talking about verisimilitude, which is not an easy word to say. So I promise you, I'm going to stumble on it at least 10, 15 times today. But what is this word and why does it matter to game design? Verisimilitude is the idea of internal uh, consistency of a world, right? Some people use the term realism when they talk about a game. Does a game feel real, right? Does your tabletop RPG feel like it is a consistent thing? And when they're talking about that sort of inconsistency, they're not when they're talking about that realism. What they're really talking most often is verisimilitude, right? That the world itself feels internally consistent to itself. Because if you're talking about realism in a fantasy role playing game, you're already off the right track of the conversation, right? You're not talking about a thing that matters. When you have wizards who can cast fireballs in the middle of the street or in a crowded dungeon, right? You're not talking about realism at that point. What you're talking about, most likely, is verisimilitude, right? Is the feeling that the world as presented is consistent in itself, right? It makes sense. The things you are telling people are concepts that do not surprise them, right? That feel like they're accurate to the world as you are presenting it to them. So when you are trying to create a world, right? You're trying to create a world that has this sense of verisimilitude, right? This consistency, this coherency through everything that you're writing. I appreciate the beard shout out. I started growing it prior to the shutdown, and is certainly going to continue doing its thing until I am Gandalf level of beard going on. What I am really excited about with this verisimilitude thing, right? Like I have been thinking about this for a few days anyway. I've mentioned it actually a couple of times in the various live streams, but I think it was today reading the Heroes on the Borderlands starter set, right? Dungeons and Dragons, Wizards of the Coast, Hasbro, all the amazing people involved put out a new starter set. I've got both of the new starter sets, the Hellfire Club one and the Heroes on the Borderlands one, right? And I started reading Borderlands. It is a very good update to the original Keep on the Borderlands module. I actually think it does a really good job of turning that the concepts of that into something that I would easily run, and would want to run based on it. I couldn't run it as a one shot. It's not a one shot starter set. It is a Chronicle in a box starter set, right? And as a tool to have that sort of adventure path, small level adventure path that you'd run over 3, 4, maybe 5 sessions, maybe more. You could wring a lot of sessions out of the material that you're provided with, right, in this starter set, which is fantastic. I actually think there's more content than the 3 levels they provide for the character classes that they have. And that's not bad, right? Like, it gives you an opportunity to say, hey, cool, we made it to level 3. Let's print out real character sheets, right? And turn these into 4th level characters and continue until we've completed all the various quests here. The problem that I had with the box set is it absolutely fails miserably at verisimilitude, right? And it does so in 2 different ways. The first way that it fails in verisimilitude is it's got this keep, right? The keep on the borderlands. My own website, Keep on the Heathlands, is a reference to the keep on the borderlands, right? Keep on the borderlands, the keep itself has, I think it's 15 named NPCs, right? It's presented as a small medieval-ish castle that's clearly on some border, right? We're not given any country that it's a part of. We don't really know where the borderlands are. And I say this knowing that we do in context of the other things that reference the borderlands over the years, right? But just working from the starter set, right? We have this keep, we have these borderlands, we have a little bit of territory around them, and we have a relatively straightforward, if not a little bit silly, plot of this group of chaos worshipping people that are out there. And maybe I'll get into that, maybe I won't. It doesn't really matter to my point, but I've been reading it because I've got it and I was excited to check it out and see how good of a starter set it was. But verisimilitude, right? There are two major parts that break the verisimilitude of the setting of the keep on the borderlands. The first is you've got this keep, and the keep has no farms. Keep does have one stable of livestock, and it has no farms around it, right? And the obvious question that anyone would have if they're thinking for more than 10 minutes about the economy of this place is, how are they keeping themselves fed, right? And you might answer that by they're trading everything. They're getting everything brought into them along the trade route that the characters come on. And that's an answer. It's kind of a weird answer. Like, in this sort of setting, you would imagine there would be farms. People would build farms to have basic crops that they would need, right? The other verisimilitude issue is that the characters all appear to be weird single adults with no families, no relations to each other, right? There are multiple halflings within the keep. There are multiple dwarves. There are multiple humans. And they don't appear to be related in any way, shape, or form, right? And that's fine. You could have a keep that is a military stronghold, right? There would all be military people there, and that could make sense. But they're presented as civilians, right? They are presented as if there's nothing deeper, right, about who they are or why they're there. They have no connections outside of the fact that they are physically in this location. And that feels weird, right? That kind of breaks verisimilitude. And you can fix that very easily by saying, okay, this keep is big enough for about 50 people. 20 of them are the chamberlain who runs the keep, right? The military outpost leader and their troops. And the other 30 of them are what used to be a small village of people that have collected around the keep and live there and support the keep, right? And there, I would lean in and say those families were a small group of halflings that have been living there for a long time, a small group of dwarves that have lived in this village, and they interact with the humans and the elves that came in as part of the military group, right? That creates quickly a verisimilitude to make the place make sense, right? It's coherent and consistent at that point. As I was reading through the NPCs, I was like, when are we going to get an elf? Because I see a lot of halflings, a lot of dwarves, and humans. And I'm like, so what we're going to get is we're going to get at least one elf, right? Because that's the way this kind of older school D&D would do it. Elves were less frequent in a Tolkien sort of style, right? Where there would be less elves in a space. And there are two. So there are two elves, and they are the Chamberlain and his advisor. And this is, it's an interesting twist, right? Like, I initially assumed they would be the Chamberlain Lord and his lady, right? And they're not. They are designed so that the advisor is just an advisor and the Chamberlain is a Chamberlain, right? Love that. I think that's fantastic. That fits really well, right? But it begs the question, why are there two elves here in charge, right? Why are there two elves here in charge? We don't know. We're not given that. And you can build in some verisimilitude into the setting by adding some specific element there, right? For example, the king of this kingdom is an elf. The majority of people in the stronghold segment of the nation, whatever that nation is, ignoring all of the other connections that the Keep on the Borderlands has to greater D&D lore, right? We don't have any of that. We're not working off of any of that. I would say the elves are the dominant structure within the royal system of this nation, right? Then it makes sense, right? An elf gets appointed as the lord of this border area, and that moves forward, right? Now there might be tensions there. They might not. People might not mind that the elves are the ruling class in this society. I would say largely people have tensions when there is a ruling class, but that gets into a deeper level of verisimilitude, right? That one not as important, particularly if you're running a fairly unserious sort of fantasy world, right? But so that's the keep itself that I had verisimilitude issues with. Now I'm going to transition, literally with the way the camera works, I'm going to transition to talking about the Caves of Chaos, right? The Caves of Chaos are this main segment of where the monsters are in the Keep on the Borderlands region. And there's the wilderness. The wilderness is the area you may explore before you get to the caves. The wilderness is large. It makes sense. Its encounters are all, spread around a vast area. I have no concerns there. And then you get to the Caves of Chaos, right? And I took this picture because it made me laugh when I looked at it. Each one of these caves is about 40 feet away from each other. And that's fine. A series of caves, right? Caves do this. Cave mouths can do this. But in each one of these caves is a different type of monster, right? I'm checking the chat because the chat in the OBS window, for whatever reason, went away and I can't find it again. So these caves, 40 feet away from each other, mouths 40 feet away from each other, all have a different monster in them, right? That claims this space, or several monsters that claim these spaces. And then there's this cult, right? This cult to chaos that also has one of these caves. Some of these caves are connected. The big problem here is most of these are intelligent creatures, right? You have kobolds, you have goblins, you have two dragons. You've got creatures that for sure could live next to each other if there was a reason for it, right? If there was some sort of verisimilitude that connected these caves to a culture, right? Or a community of some form. But no, they are presented in very classic D&D fashion as a bunch of monsters randomly right next to each other, not interacting with each other, not eating each other. At least one of these creatures is a mercenary, though, who you can hire to help you murder everything else, I guess. But it breaks the verisimilitude very quickly looking at this map, right? Looking at this map and going, next door is an entirely different group of monsters who have no reason to not interact with these ones, right? So why, right? What is there? And I would fix this verisimilitude-wise. It would be very easy. And just say the caves are not next to each other, right? Like these caves are spread over a large territory, several miles, maybe like 20, 30 mile stretch of space for all of these different caves to be in, right? It can be a very rocky terrain, very mountainous, very cavernous space. And it would all make sense very quickly, right? There are a couple of these caves I would keep connected either by long passageways or the fact that, no, there are a couple of caves near each other, right? And they're used by different things in those caves. there's a burrow behind our house that both rabbits and groundhogs use, right? Like it's a possibility that monsters could exist in both these spaces, right? And it would make sense. But you're not going to have 15, 10, 11, have a bunch. You're not going to have this many caves next to one another if you in any sort of verisimilitudic world, right? It doesn't make sense that they would be connected to each other. So it's just odd, right? My friend Dan just mentioned that he grew up in a nice cave neighborhood. I believe it. As a wonderful trollkin of a human being, Dan, I believe that your cavernous neighborhood was amazingly beautiful. But these are the caves of chaos, right? And I looked at this map, I laughed, and then I read the rest of the thing and I laughed more, right? Because it breaks that sense of, again, some people would incorrectly say realism, but they're talking about verisimilitude, right? It doesn't feel coherent or consistent. It just feels weird, right? Why would you have these various people living next to each other, right? Like this without any interaction? How is that making any sort of sense? So, talked about that. I loved the starter set though. I think it's got great materials. It's an excellent tool. If you don't, dig into the problems like I do, right? So we've talked about verisimilitude in an example. I want to talk about doing that in your own role-playing game, right? Building verisimilitude into the things that you are designing. I don't know how to mute my mic, so I apologize for this can of water opening. So when you are building verisimilitude, right, it sometimes takes notes, right, for you to write down some of the internal consistencies that you are working to present. If you are running a game in a fantasy RPG setting, right, you've got to create some internal consistencies. Magic and healing is a great topic to talk about internal consistency, right? If you have disease in your world and you have magical healing, you need to explain why. And people go, well, what do you mean? If you have magical healing and you have disease in your setting, how are diseases unhealed by your magical healing, right? You have to create, it can be a hand-wavy reason, right? But you have to have some reason for it, right? For example, you could say in your fantasy role-playing game setting, magic cannot heal viruses. This doesn't have to be explained by anyone in the world, right? Your clerics don't have to know why, right? They may be unable to influence or get rid of viruses, right? They can only heal cuts and scrapes and wounds on people, right? Those are the only things they can heal. They cannot heal diseases caused by viruses. Perhaps they have a separate spell that allows them to heal bacteria, right? To remove bacteria from the body. And if you are removing bacteria from the body, that is a different activity, right? That is an antibiotic activity. You could create a spell that does that. Of course, from a modern science standpoint, there are good bacteria that are in our body that if you're removing all of them, that could be bad. But you can hand wave that a little bit and contain the verisimilitude of your healing magic, right? Or you could say that your healing only works very soon after infection, right? Like immediately after infection, a healing spell would work. You just don't often know, right, when someone's been infected, so you wouldn't know that disease was present to prevent it early. You can do things like that, right? And that would make sense. Again, battlefield healing works. It happens when it's used immediately. It reduces the likelihood of things like gangrene and infections and things like that in your world. But you should have people be aware of that, right? When they're aware, hey, we have a magical healer with us. We don't get infections as often. Scrapes and wounds and things like that don't cause us as many problems. Those are good things. My friend Pete just made a note about the caves, and I think he's right. The reason the caves are so closely together is to make the map make sense, right? To have a map that you can see on a single page, and I think that's probably 100% accurate, right? Um, but that's fine, right? You can fix it and create a solid verisimilitudic sense to that setting and make it work. But healing, let's talk about the other element of healing, right? In a D&D fantasy world, in a fantasy world that's similar to D&D, you have adventurers going out and fighting monsters, right? Fighting lots of monsters. And in that world, what happens in the real world when you have a lot of people fighting each other is you have a lot of war wounded, right? You have people, and I don't mean to get super dark, super deep, but maybe trigger warning on this a little bit. But like, war wounds happen in a world where people are fighting regularly, and people lose limbs in war, right? People lose parts of their bodies in war, to be frank about it. And so having people with those sorts of wounds would be more common in the classic D&D fantasy world where there are a lot of adventurers out fighting monsters. Unless, except, magical healing done really quickly prevents the loss of limbs, right? Prevents the loss of pieces of ears and eyes and things like that, right? That makes sense, right? If you say, hey, yep, you've got a specific amount of time, magical healing, if you do that in time, you don't have to worry about it, right? And there's only so much of that you have to explain in your world. But if your players start seeing a bunch of people without arms, right, or without legs or in wheelchairs, they might wonder why, right? Why wasn't healing effective for those people? Maybe they don't have, maybe there are not a lot of clerics in the world, right? Maybe there are not a lot of clerics in the world that can cast healing spells. And so when you have a healer come into those areas where they do not have a lot of healing spells, you're going to get mobbed probably if you have a cleric in your group, right? Anyone who can cast those solid healing spells would be incredibly important, right? Would be incredibly valued, would be incredibly sought out by people, because people want their family members to be whole, right? They want to be personally whole as much as possible. We have decades of horror stories, both real and not real, about the problems people have with their bodies, right? Then the internal consistency of bodily sovereignty is a thing, right? So healing, magical healing, if it exists in your world, you should think about those things to increase the verisimilitude. But the other side of that is if your healing can't restore limbs, which is fine, that's a thing that is can be internally consistent. Magic still exists, and movement magic exists, right? Things that allow you to move easily from one place to another, or easier, exist. There's tons of magic spells that do that. So tools like wheelchairs and other forms of movement support that are magically created, right? Magically assisted, or at least meet engineering standards that fit a world with the type of magic that you have. That's 100% internally consistent, right? That has verisimilitude, because your magic is just the reason for those tools to exist. Because when you have magic, those tools would exist, right? This is one of the reasons why I like Eberron so much as a setting, is because it has a lot of verisimilitude. It looks at the magic of the world and it says, oh, Yeah, magic would fit these things, right? It would. Why would we have gas lamps if we could just cast ever burning lantern or whatever the spell is um, on a thing around our community, right? You wouldn't necessarily need electricity in that world if you can simulate electricity using other magical tools. That creates an internal verisimilitude. And it's these things don't have to be perfect. It is okay to have gaps that people don't explain in world, right? It's okay to have gaps that you haven't answered as a designer or a game master, right? But when your players ask, this is a tool I often use, right? When you're running a game, if your players ask, hey, what about this weirdness? Why? You can turn it around on them and say, well, what do you think could be the reasons for this thing, right? What are the reasons? What is the possible answers for this? Do you want to investigate that? Like, is it a greater mystery you're interested in delving into? Having players, particularly higher level ones, go through the planes and asking gods, why don't you heal wounds that are over, 48 hours in existence? It would be, to me, an incredibly interesting campaign to have players walk through the planes and asking gods that question, right? Fascinating. I would be fascinated by writing that for my players, by producing that sort of story for them, and their exploration of it, right? And in them seeking a sense of internal understanding of their own setting would be driving that sort of storyline. And you may not, right? You also might say, you know what? I don't have the specific answer for that. But players get bothered when when a lack of verisimilitude is obvious. When it is missing, players lose connections to the setting. For example, modern day setting, let's use Vampire the Masquerade as an example. The rise of cell phones made it very unlikely that vampires could continue to be hidden in the world, right? This masquerade of vampires being able to hide amongst humanity, it makes sense in a pre 2000s world. Vaguely say that, right? But cameras existed, right? Video cameras existed. There were tools that people could use to record vampires before the early 2000s, but they were more easily kind of controlled and that information was restricted, right? So continuing a world where there is a masquerade, where vampires are unknown by humanity, you have to create a reason for that. In 5th edition Vampire, the reason is vampires have gone as little tech as possible, right? They have avoided modern technology. They don't use cell phones. They don't communicate via technology anymore. And the reason they're doing so is because the Second Inquisition has discovered them online, and they are trying their best to avoid being caught by the government and these hunters, right? And that has elements of verisimilitude to it, right? That makes some level of sense. You still have the problem with people with cell phones recording vampires, but vampires have this system in Vampire the Masquerade. They have these systems that they've built over centuries to restrict and or shift the narrative, so whatever people put out there on the internet looks fake, right? Is accepted as a fake because they've established this masquerade that is multi levels of communication restriction and scrubbing. It's the word I've been trying to look for like the last minute. They scrub references, so anything that's put out there looks like it's something created by horror buffs, right? All of that contains an element of verisimilitude. It feels real. It deals with the issue of like, well, why wouldn't vampires be caught by this? And saying some are, and yet they do a good job of making people not believe that thing to be true. And that's a big thing in the world of darkness, right? The sense of believing a thing to be true is really important in the grand scheme to the metaphysics of that world. In Werewolf 5th edition, for folks who don't know, not a fan of Werewolf 5th edition by White Wolf. But what I will say about it is I will want to talk about the tribes in Werewolf, right? A tribe is a group. A tribe often is a group of related people who have built a shared culture of some form, right? There's often forms of initiation within a tribe, allowing for outsiders to join the tribe, right? There are systems of initiation to belonging to a tribe. And tribe is a very powerful word, right? For good and bad. It's got some good and positive connotations. It's got some bad and negative connotations as well. But a tribe means a thing, right? And so originally, in Werewolf the Apocalypse, the werewolves, and Werewolf the Apocalypse was the very first werewolf fiction to have this. Werewolves were born as werewolves, right? And so werewolves were born and arose in various human cultures, and or existed prior to human culture, depending on who you ask. And they created these small cultural groups within the bigger culture that they were born within, right? So they were a subculture within various human cultures. So they were a tribe that was part of a larger grouping of tribes that eventually become nations, right? For example, the Fianna originally were largely werewolves who were born in Celtic regions of the world. You see all my air quotes because the way Celtic was defined in the Roman era when the term came out was just a group of like barbarians that lived on one side of the river versus barbarians who lived on another side of the river. Celtic versus Germanic is kind of a red herring of a term. That is a whole... I'm getting way off topic. But the Fianna. Fianna were this tribe. They were largely based in Ireland. They had some parts of their nation, parts of their tribe in Scotland and Spain and a few other places. And then America, right? There were a lot of Fianna that were originally from Ireland that came over and were in the Americas, right? Canada, the United States, Mexico, South America, etc., right? They lived in the Americas. The Fianna, as a tribe, have that connection largely to Irish culture, right? And there were some serious problems. Do not get me wrong. There were some serious problems with the depiction of the Fianna tribe as an element, as a connection group to Irish culture. But in 5th edition, and this is the problem, I'll actually talk about the problem before I talk about 5th edition more. The problem with this is that with werewolves being born as werewolves, there were some problems with the way they described the fact that werewolves were a dying species, right? And that has some implications that are negative, right? When you think about, oh, this ethnic group dying out, it can be problematic, right? To have that sort of thing. It can cause stress for people. So in 5th edition, they decided to remove the human cultural elements from all of the various tribes within Werewolf the Apocalypse. And that is an option. That is an option. It makes some level of sense because they're saying, hey, instead of these human cultures, these tribes will have their own connections. But the big problem here is that Werewolf the Apocalypse 5th edition doesn't fill that gap with anything, right? there's no reason for the tribal divisions to exist. Werewolves are no longer explicitly born werewolves, right? No one knows how werewolves are created exactly in Werewolf 5th edition. It's kind of left to be not mattered, and I can live with that, right? I don't necessarily need a reason for werewolves to exist. I can just say, okay, werewolves exist, right? But why do these tribes exist, right? What is it that binds these groups together? There are groups in the real world that are bound together, that don't require any direct relationship to each other, right? There are people, gamers are an example, right? Gamers get together, we have a shared hobby, that thing binds us together, right? People who play Fallout New Vegas have a strangely strong connection to one another, right? There are people around the world who are into pottery, right? Knitters and crocheters, amazingly capable, sitting down, becoming best friends, working on projects, chatting all day because they have that shared interest, right? Of crochet and knitting. It builds a connection quickly, right? These things can bind people, right? I've kind of a joke with knitting and crocheting, literally binding, but like building that relationship, there's a thing there, right? So how are these tribes bound together? And we're not given anything in Werewolf the Apocalypse 5th edition for why the tribes exist as coherent tribes, right? Maybe, and it could easily be that the people of the tribe have a particular patron spirit, right? And a patron spirit could be the thing, the object, the energy, the person, the god that reaches out to them and goes, "You belong to me, right? You are a part of my people. I am going to imbue you with powers and gifts, and you will be my werewolf," right? That saying that right there would be enough. It would be that would be a huge leap to saying, "Yep, that's why," right? Falcon has chosen you to be a Silver Fang. Every other chosen by Falcon is a Silver Fang. You are part of the Silver Fang tribe. We're not given that. Hence my problem with the verisimilitude of the tribal connection there. Vampires in Vampire the Masquerade are all embraced by a vampire of the clan that they are also a part of, right? That is a supernatural curse that is directly passed on to them, vampire to vampire, that connects them to that clan, right? Boom, obvious, easy. You've got that clear connection that doesn't create any verisimilitudic concerns because it's consistent, it's coherent, it makes sense why that connection exists, right? Let's go in a totally different direction, right? Urban Shadows is a game, Urban Shadows 2nd edition, which is the only one I've read. I actually never read 1st edition Urban Shadows. Read Urban Shadows 2, and you've got these different, you've got your playbooks, right? And your playbooks have these different connections that are based on kind of the type of playbook that you have. And these, Mortalis is one of them, right? And these are like more mortally type people that have playbooks that are sort of connected to each other versus the ones that are more monstrous, right? There's a group that's more monstrous, and that includes, your werewolves and your vampires, and I think other things like that, right? That devour and eat and consume. So you have these different connections to each other. But Urban Shadows is designed to be more sandboxy of a game, right? Where you're given much more high level sorts of tools to build your own reasons for things, right? Your own connections, your own groups within the city that you're building. In May I Enter, we do something very similar, right? Your vampire playbooks are not like groups of vampires who are directly connected to one another. There's no connection between one vamp to another vamp, one Riz to another Riz, right? That connection is inherently not there. It's a toolbox of descriptors to help your players build their specific character, right? For you as the narrator to build NPCs that fit into the world. But everything's designed to be a little bit looser. It's not quite as strict, but it still has verisimilitude because you, as the narrator, are building the verisimilitude of your setting, right? So I'm trying to explain the different layers of ensuring verisimilitude, right? Because if you have a heavily detailed setting, you're going to need to do more work to ensure verisimilitude than you do if you have a fairly light hand on your setting. Shadow Dark is a great example of this, right? Shadow Dark is an OSR inspired dungeon crawling tabletop RPG. It gives you this idea. You're going into these caverns, the dark, and you are exploring them. And you're told in the text of that book, some of this doesn't make sense, right? These spaces you're going into are weird, right? They are not necessarily coherent. And that weirdness is part of the exploration. And that provides the verisimilitude, right? The strange is a Monty Cook setting slash game of its own. It doesn't actually have its own separate game mechanics versus the greater cipher system. But it's segments, right? There's a term, and I cannot remember it right now. I'm probably going to look it up real quick just to make sure I get it right. But it has these different segments, right? These limited pocket dimensions. I'm trying to get the word. Recursions is the word, right? So the strange has these various recursions that are like separate settings in and of themselves, and you can travel between these different recursions, right? And there isn't verisimilitude between the two, between any of the settings, and that is okay because the game tells you that, right? It says you're going to travel between these recursions and your experience in them is going to be different. It's going to be weird, right? When you have a game like Torg, right? Torg Eternity, you're going between worlds that are explicitly alternate dimensions, right? And they don't have a direct connection to each other. But the verisimilitude is you are a group of people moving between these alternate dimensions in whichever of these games you're running, and that is the explanation for that weirdness, right? For that different disconnect. Thank you, Quinn, for recursions. I found it before I noticed it in the chat, but I appreciate you throwing that out there. This is just kind of like a diatribe now about different types of settings that still have verisimilitude in them. But it's one of the struggles I always have with adventures, right? When I read an adventure written by another writer, almost always, and I have done the same, almost always you have to make some decisions that don't provide enough information. And so you will often shorthand a thing and just say, well, this thing is there, and you don't always provide an explanation for why, right? You want a certain encounter to exist. Maybe you've used a random table to produce it, but it just doesn't feel. If you pull back the layer a little bit, it doesn't feel incredibly consistent, right? And again, not necessarily a bad thing, just a thing that could be true, right? But if you dig into it and there's a lack of that consistency, players will see it, right? They'll feel it at the table. So you have to figure out ways, both as a writer and as a GM, to ensure that verisimilitude questions are reduced as much as possible because they break people's engagement or immersion, right? To use the LARP word, in the game, right? They break you out of the fiction, and they make you pay attention to things that are not the story, right? Which is what you're trying to do, is get people engaged in the story. And I was going to start with this example of an issue with verisimilitude from a classic setting. And I came at this conversation from a different way because I happened to be reading the box set at the beginning. But one of the reasons Ravenloft exists as a setting book is, or as an adventure to begin with, is because Tracy Hickman looked at a map for a D&D adventure, and there was a vampire randomly in this dungeon, right? And he's like, vampire's an intelligent, capable monster. Why would he be in this dungeon, right? Why would he randomly be in here? And he wouldn't, right? And so they wrote Ravenloft because it allowed the vampire to be a monster who was in a space that made sense for a vampire to be in, right? It fit for Strahd to live in a grand castle with a great, set of dungeons underneath it. That makes sense, right? The Greater Curse of Strahd setting all makes sense because Barovia, as a place, has tons of verisimilitude, right? It has its own little internal weirdnesses, but they all track when you know what the setting is, right? The setting is a prison for Strahd, and then some of the weirdness internal to it can make sense. People can accept the fiction of it, right? In Curse of Strahd, they say that a certain portion of the people in the setting aren't really people, right? They're kind of these unsoulless automatons who just exist to continue the story. I hate that. I've never liked that, but it doesn't break verisimilitude, right? It allows the setting to reset and other people to go to the same place and experience the same things, and they're just kind of all in this cycle, this Groundhog Day event, right? Where Strahd is always the same, the experiences are always the same, but you as a narrator, if you keep your players going back, it can be different. It can be different, right? Because they've changed things, and that can shift the setting as well. But it's interesting, like Barovia as a place is one of the really good examples for ensuring verisimilitude really only needs to be at a certain level for the setting to feel okay for players, right? They buy into the fiction. And really, like, stealing the idea of bus tickets from Bonus Experience, right? Great podcast, recommend it. They talk about bus tickets, right? You're giving players not a plot, right, that they have to follow, but you're saying, hey, there's a story here if you want to dig into it, right? And verisimilitude ensures that the stories that the bus tickets that they're grabbing to play those stories that they're looking to play feel consistent, coherent, and focused to the world, right? It all feels connected, and you're not giving them red herrings, right? If your players are the type of players who are like, oh my gosh, this fish in a pool, we want to like seduce it and like have it be our boyfriend, you can do that, no judgment, but that may not be the bus ticket you're trying to give them, right? And the reason they're grabbing onto it can be either there's too much verisimilitude, right? There's too much like belief that they can do anything in the setting, or they just don't believe in any of the fiction of the setting, and so they're willing to do just crazy things because they don't feel like the setting is grounded in anything materially coherent and consistent. And I've talked almost completely about fantasy settings, but sci-fi settings are just as much need a layer of verisimilitude to work, right? a sci-fi setting where you say, yep, the force is a power that is out there, right? There's some sort of magical energy that certain space wizards can call on and do different things with. Great. Every single person that hears that will get it, right? They grok the setting almost immediately. And then you add, because you're trying to like deepen the verisimilitude, you add midichlorians to the setting, which are force mitochondria? Don't know, right? There's some sort of thing that's in people's blood that tells you how powerful in the force they are. And it's funny because when George Lucas did that in the prequels, it actually broke the verisimilitude of the setting. It made it feel not internally consistent at that point. It added a pseudo-scientific explanation for force users to exist that didn't need to be there, right? It didn't increase the verisimilitude of the setting by adding midichlorians, right? It actually kind of broke it down and said, oh, well, now there's this explanation. So does everyone have midichlorians, right? It makes you have more questions without a lot of solid answers. Got a thing in the chat here that I'm going to read real quick. Yeah. Great comment that sci-fi settings have pressure to be more explainable, right? And fantasy has more built-in RPG tropes and RPG kind of explanations that people can accept and live with. I think that's true. Sci-fi generally has certain layers of explainability that it needs to have, right? Aliens, you need to have an idea of what environment they evolved in for that to make sense. I think it depends on the type of science fiction that you're playing with, right? And if you go high weird sci-fi, right? It is very easy to just say the human expectations about the scientific explanations for the universe are actually kind of wrong, and these things are true, right? To explain the various things that exist in this setting. But it depends, because it kind of depends on the genre you're working with too. Alien, like the aliens in the Alien RPG, the xenomorphs. The storyline behind the xenomorphs is kind of complex. It's not, because of the way the canon has shifted over the years, it's not particularly consistent anymore. But you don't need the explanation for why the xenomorphs exist to make sense for the story to work in a horror game about the xenomorphs, with xenomorphs in them, right? Instead, to have verisimilitude in that setting, you want any queens to act like the alien queen, right? You want any of the facehuggers to act like facehuggers. You want the things in the world to feel consistent. You want your weapons to work consistently. You want the electricity on the ships to work consistently. You want explanations about faster than light travel to work consistently in the narrative, right? Star Trek Adventures is great for saying, hey, warp is as fast as you need it to be, right? Travel takes as long as you need it to take for the fiction to make sense. And making the fiction make sense is a key part of it, right? That's what verisimilitude is keeping the story internally consistent. If you tell your players, hey, it's going to take you 6 months to go from Earth to Alpha Centauri, it should probably take you 6 months every time, unless there is a way that they can break that consistent travel time restriction, right? Maybe they go at a higher warp speed than they are usually able to go at. Maybe they hurt their ship by doing that, right? There should be a reason that creates that sort of powerful explanation for it occurring. So my friend Quinn says, I think you're wending your way to a fantastic point. Occasionally explanations will break verisimilitude. To add to it, mystery is often more acceptable to players, which is exactly right, right? Like sometimes not explaining a thing actually does increase verisimilitude. I find this more in sci-fi settings, right? Where you don't explain the thing as deeply, right? You just give a sort of hand-wavy technobabble answer. That's not real, right? It's not grounded in anything. It just sounds good enough, right? Star Trek does that constantly, right? Where it just technobabbles a thing. Most sci-fi does this, and that's fine, right? It's when you over invest in the explanation that often then you are encouraging questions that break the verisimilitude of it. We're getting to the end of this today, so I'm going to wrap things up. I want to thank everybody who's been watching these. Today has been the most engagement we've got over the last few days that we've been doing them, and I really appreciate that. I think this episode's been a really positive one. As I've said before, I am currently shut down and furloughed, but I am not yet putting out the tip hat. If there is a need for that, I will be doing so under the description in the various things in the days to come. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, please drop them in the chat or drop them in the comment section on the video after the fact, and I will get to them. Thank you very much. Like I said, my name is Josh Heath. I will be back tomorrow. I'm not 100% sure what I'll be talking about. I am trying to read more RPG books during this break. So I'll probably have more thoughts that are inspired by various things that I'm reading. So thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you soon.